between the candidates for the 18th District State Senate seat. Democrat Mark Harris, Republican Dan Feyen. Mark Harris is here. Dan Feyen, apparently a scheduling conflict. He's not in the studio, so we'll see if he shows up before the top of the hour, and we will reschedule this debate if both candidates agree to that, coming up hopefully within the next week. Mark Harris is the Winnebago County executive. He made the announcement several months ago that he was running for the state Senate seat being vacated by Republican Rick Gudex of Fond du Lac, and Mark Harris joins us in studio. Great to have you on the program.
Well, thanks for having me here.
Pleasure having you on the show. And first of all, tell the listeners about yourself and why you decided to run for state Senate.
Well, I've got prior experience in other states as a CPA and as an attorney, and I came to Oshkosh about 21 years ago, served part-time on the city council and as mayor briefly, while I was working as a trust banker for Associated Trust Company, and that all was good experience, but the opportunity came up to run for county executive, and I was elected to that position a little over 11 years ago. And I've really enjoyed being the county executive. I've done a good job there. The tax rate's a little lower than it was when I started. The total county spending's a little bit lower than it was when I started. But I've managed to cut the county's tax, or their debt, nearly in half. And that's how I've controlled the other two, the tax rate and the spending, is by cutting that debt so much. And now I'd like to go to the state Senate. I think I can have a favorable impact on their policies, especially with regard to spending and budgeting issues. And I'm hoping that the voters will decide they'd like me there too.
All right. You ran for Congress a couple of years ago as well.
I did. I ran for Congress in the 6th. It was a good experience. And quite frankly, this campaign stands on the shoulders of that one, because that campaign allowed me to build up a base of donors, as well as have contacts that have served me well in this race.
You just heard, you were in the studio when I was talking with the editor at WisPolitics.com, J.R. Ross, the U.S. Supreme Court declining to hear the appeal of the lawsuit known as John Doe 2. What is your reaction to that?
Well, the Supreme Court turns down most of the cases that are offered to it. They only take select cases. They can't take everything. So it's not a surprise that they turned it down. But personally, I would have preferred them to take it up. I think it might reflect unfavorably on our state Supreme Court had they taken it up, because two of the justices that didn't recuse themselves actually benefited from Club for Growth money, and I think they should have recused themselves. And that was really the issue being taken to the Supreme Court.
I know sometimes we think the cases that happen in our state are huge cases with big ramifications, and I think a lot of people thought maybe this John Doe case could have had an impact not just in Wisconsin but in other states across the country. So in that respect, I guess I was at least somewhat surprised when I heard the news this morning.
Well, I just think that the focus would have been on whether those Supreme Court justices should have recused themselves.
That was part of the question.
Yeah, and it would just bring it back to where it was when it was before the state Supreme Court.
All right. We're going to take a short break. Dan Feyen, the Republican candidate, is on the telephone, and let's see if we've got him on the line here. Are you there, Dan?
I am here, yes.
And why aren't you here?
We did not have anything on our calendar for this morning, and we thought this was another day, so.
All right. Well, we had this scheduled for the last 3 weeks. Maybe it just wasn't put down. And anyway, tell the listeners about yourself and why you're running for the state Senate.
A little bit about me. I grew up in the New Holsting area. After graduating from high school, I went to technical college at Fox Valley Tech. Graduated with a diploma in printing and have been employed with the same printing company in the Fond du Lac area for 29 years. married for 22 years, have a son at UW-Madison and a daughter at Fond du Lac High School. I've been involved in the Fond du Lac JCs for many years, and after JCs, I got involved in the Fond du Lac County Republican Party, and that's how I got involved in politics. And from there, I became chairman for the last 10 years of the Fond du Lac County Party and district chairman of the district party for the last 3 to 4 years. And current Senator Rick Gudek decided not to run. He said, Dan, you should think about it. So we thought about it, my wife and I and family. We've thought about it for quite a long time. We decided to jump in the race, and here we are today, 5 weeks away from the election virtually, and we're closing in on the finish line. We're working hard every day, so that's a little bit about me.
All right, and I asked Mark Harris this question. I'll ask you the same question. The U.S. Supreme Court, just within the last hour, decided not to hear the lawsuit on the appeal of the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruling concerning John Doe case number 2. Your reaction to the Supreme Court not taking that up?
I think the Supreme Court right now is, as we all know, it's split. It's a 4-4, I do believe. So going forward with something to the Supreme Court in this session yet would be kind of tough anyway. I think our Supreme Court is, I'd have to look into it more, but I think the John Doe was overreaching a little bit, so I think that's where I'll be on that one.
All right. Dan, let me ask you this question. Since 2015, the Republican legislature and Governor Walker made Wisconsin the 25th right-to-work state, partially eliminated the state's prevailing wage, and scrapped a century-old civil service system of hiring and firing state workers. In your opinion, why do you feel these moves are either good or bad for the state economy?
I think some of the moves were good for the economy. Prevailing wage was one where it made some public projects in local municipalities more reasonable and easier on taxpayers to afford. Right to work, in some cases, it was a good thing. I think we need to keep moving forward with some things there. And what was the other one? Prevailing wage.
Wisconsin became the 25th right-to-work state, partially eliminated the state's prevailing wage, and scrapped the century-old civil service system.
The civil service probably needed some reform. Anything that's a century old, I think we start to need to look at those to see what we need to do to bring it into the 21st century.
Mark Harris, what are your thoughts on those 3 issues?
Well, I think they're very hostile to organized labor, both in the private sector and the public sector. And I think moves like that tend to reduce wages over time. I think they were probably a mistake.
Mark Harris, what would you, if you are elected to the state Senate, what would be the most important thing the state legislature could do to improve the economy and create more private and or public sector jobs?
Well, the easiest one is to invest more in public infrastructure. That when you build highways, repair bridges, that money's all spent locally, and that's an immediate boost to your economy.
Dan Fine?
Well, I think fixing the transportation fund so we can get more money into our highways and things like that is also a boost to the economy. That's one of the ways we can employ people locally, and provide a good quality infrastructure to maintain the safety of our citizens. Also, to keep a good, strong economy going here in the area with manufacturing and agriculture.
Dan, Wisconsin's unemployment rate has been steadily declining in the last couple of years. It remains below the national average, but Wisconsin continues to lag behind the nation in its private sector job growth. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics last month said Wisconsin created almost 1.6% more jobs during the year ending March 31st, well below the national average of 2.1%. Why do you think that is, and what needs to be done to reverse that trend?
Well, one of the big things right now, we have a skills gap here in our state and really in this area of the state. got a lot of businesses looking for skilled labor. The problem is they just can't find it. So I think we need to work with our technical schools, our businesses, our high schools, even some of the universities to make sure we get all the right programs in place to fill that skilled gap need. There's 80 to 90,000 jobs on the Wisconsin Job Service website right now available. Many of these are good paying jobs. Many of these are within this area of the state as well. So I think we need to look at closing the skills gap as soon as possible by investing in those programs.
Mark Harris, what's your reaction? Wisconsin ranked 33rd among the 50 states in its pace for creating jobs.
Yes, we're doing well, but we're not performing at the same rate that the national economy is. But I actually share Dan's enthusiasm for our tech school system. I served on the board for 3 years at Fox Valley Technical College. But I have to say that if the state thinks closing the skills gap is the way to go, and I agree with Dan on that, it doesn't make sense to be cutting funding for K through 12 schools, cutting funding for the technical college system, and making huge cuts to the four-year university system. That doesn't make any sense. It's not consistent with developing a workforce to meet the needs of the future.
Mark Harris, University of Wisconsin System President Ray Cross is proposing an increase in the 27-19 budget, despite Governor Scott Walker's warning to expect zero growth in the next 2 years. Cross said he can justify the increase and that it is critical to improving how long it takes students to graduate. After slashing funding for colleges and universities in the last budget to the tune of $250 million, do you support President Cross's request?
You know, just this weekend I had a chance to listen to Robin Voss talk about that very issue, and he indicated that he believed it was an appropriate request, and so I support it as well.
Would you like to expand on that?
Well, I think the university system has to be adequately funded, and when you have a declining number of students, which is likely to happen since the number of high school graduates is declining during a short interval of years, it's actually going to get more expensive per student as the costs are spread over a smaller number of students. But what we don't want to have is a false thrift. If we cut back too much on the university system and they have to offer courses less often, have less sessions of a given course, we may actually push up the number of semesters it takes a student to complete a degree, and that additional time and the living expenses during that additional time will make college even more unaffordable.
Dan Fyan, what are your thoughts on the UW System President's request for additional money in the next budget?
I think we need to seriously take a look at his request and analyze whether or not it's truly needed. They had a $250 million cut in the last budget, as you had mentioned. But we got to remember that the UW system spent more in their personal budget than they did the 2 years before that. So with a $250 million cut, they actually spent more money and still added money into their surplus funds. So we got to make sure that they're using their money wisely, putting it into classrooms, making sure kids can get out of school in the allocated time they say they should, if not a shorter time. The shorter time that they're in school, the less debt they accumulate. So I think we really need to look at it. But if it's truly needed funds, we need to support that. But we also need to make sure that they're using their money wisely and putting it in the classroom and making sure that the classes are available that the kids need to get out in the 3 to 4 years that they're looking to get out.
Dan, let me ask you this. Do you think the UW system is better today than it was before the $250 million cut?
I think it's the same. I don't think we've seen a change at all. Like I mentioned, they spent just as much money. They spent actually more money than they spent in the 2 years before that, while adding to their surplus. So I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be the same, if not a hair better. I have a son at UW-Madison. I think everyone down there is getting a good education throughout the entire UW system. We just need to make sure that the courses are offered that they need in the right amount of courses so that they can get those courses when they need them.
Mark Harris?
Well, I'm a little worried that we're losing some of our top faculty from our public institutions here. And while the change won't be dramatic, it could be significant over time.
The president of the Wisconsin Freedom of Information Council says the fight to preserve Wisconsin's open records law is not over. Republicans slipped language into the state budget earlier this year that would have shielded nearly everything government officials create from the open records law. And then after a public outcry, they backtracked. Wisconsin Freedom of Information Council President Bill Leaders says he's concerned those lawmakers will try again, noting that there were plans to have a legislative council committee study this issue. Mark Harris, should anything be done to the state open records law, any changes be made regarding the information from state lawmakers or state officials?
Look, the more information the public has access to, the more they can hold their government accountable, the more they can avoid corruption. And right now there's a perception that the state legislature is operating in a fashion that they're betraying the public interest in favor of narrow moneyed interests that can afford to make large campaign contributions. That's the exact wrong way to run a government. And freedom of information laws are one way you can find evidence of this sort of trade-off of policy for contributions. And anything that would restrict that would be a serious mistake and would undermine the public's ability to keep their government clean.
Dan Fein, what are your thoughts on what the Republicans tried to insert into the last budget regarding open records?
I'm not exactly sure what the language was that was put in there. I know there was something put in there, but I think the public has a right to see what their government's doing. I would also be open to looking at how other states do it just to make sure we have the best law possible in place. But people do have the right to have access and see what's going on within their government so that government officials can be held accountable for things that are done.
Last Thursday, every county in the state, all 72 counties, simultaneously held a public forum regarding the future of transportation and transportation funding. It's obviously been a big issue in the 18th Senate District with the delays, the ongoing delays of expanding Highway 23 to 4 lanes between Fond du Lac and Plymouth. Governor Scott Walker has said publicly that he'll keep borrowing for road projects low, but says he is opposed to raising the gas tax and registration fees to pay for transportation. What, if you are elected, Dan Fein, what would your solution be to addressing the state transportation budget and the $940 million shortfall?
Well, the one thing I would look at doing is we got to look at putting all the solutions to fixing this problem on the table. It is a problem. We're not generating enough revenue to meet the needs of our infrastructure. Our economy relies on that. Our safety of our citizens rely on it. Highway 23 in this current budget gets kicked down the road even further. This was first proposed in 1999 at a cost of $45 million. This last year would have been $145 million. So every year we keep delaying projects. It just keeps going up and up and up. How much is Highway 23 going to cost when we really get around to it? I don't even want to know what that number is. It's going to be crazy high. But we need to put all the solutions on the table and then come up with the best possible solution. Put all the ideas in we got to put the best possible puzzle together to meet that need. Because when we borrow money, that's not a good solution, because when we're paying it back half of it out of the general fund as well. We're just cutting into other things like education and good programs that the state has going that are needed as well.
Mark Harris?
Dan and I have a lot of agreement on this, that borrowing is definitely not the answer. The more we've borrowed over time, the more of our gas tax and registration revenues go to servicing debt rather than to repairing roads and bridges. So borrowing's not the answer. We know that we probably would benefit from more investment in infrastructure. personally, I'm willing to have a very small increase in the gas tax if that helps reduce that borrowing. And I think it's a responsible decision because we're all driving cars that have been getting more efficient. We're buying less gallons of gas. Some cars use barely any gas. And then they're not contributing anything towards maintaining the roads and the bridges. And the condition of the roads and the bridges has really deteriorated. And Dan mentioned about general purpose revenue. We've now poured $500 million more of GPR, general purpose revenue, into the highway fund than was ever borrowed out of it. So now we're actually taking from schools and municipalities and other users of general purpose revenue to fill this huge gap we've created in transportation. We really need to find an adequate, dedicated source of revenue for transportation. You know, we're all going to pay more through car repairs and additional transportation costs of the goods we consume if we don't maintain the roads.
Final 2 minutes to make closing arguments. Mark Harris, Winnebago County Executive, Democratic candidate for the 18th state Senate seat.
I think I've had a really good record as county executive, one that I'm very proud of, and I think one that the public would support. And I'm asking the public, the listeners here, to support me or consider supporting me in November. I will serve them well in the Senate. I'm going to be willing to work across the aisle. But we can't have one party in control of all the levers of power when they've not been responsible about doing so.
Dan Fine.
Well, going forward, I think we're going to have some big decisions to make. I'm willing to go to Madison and make the big, tough decisions, whether it comes to transportation or, you know, saving money on taxes throughout the budget elsewhere. I think we need to have smaller, smarter government in Madison. A smaller, smarter government is a better government, a more accountable government. So I think I can do that and take leadership to Madison from a different point of view, a business perspective that I've been in for 29 years. So going down to Madison, there'll be a lot of tough decisions to make going forward in the next budget and with everything else that may come up. So I ask for your vote for Dan Fine on November 8th, and I thank you for having me on today.
Republican Dan Fine, Democrat Mark Harris, both running for the 18th District State Senate seat. Greatly appreciate both of you joining us on the program this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Something exciting has happened in banking in southeastern Wisconsin. American Bank and National Exchange Bank and Trust are now together as one under the